Asterisk. They kicked me out naked, the fat girl cried, shivering in the snow, clutching nothing but a torn white cloth. The crowd jeered, their laughter colder than the winter wind. She was only 18, cast out like trash. But then hooves thundered through the street. A mountain man dismounted, his voice cutting like steel. "Get on my horse now." What began as a rescue on a frozen night soon turned into a fight for survival. Because hidden inside her father's old trunk was a deed proof of land worth more than gold. And powerful enemies would do anything to take it. Fires would burn, guns would rise, and even the law would turn its back. Now, her courage and his scars are the only thing standing against greed, shame, and the cruelty of a whole town. Will the girl they mocked find the strength to claim her place in the world, or will the frontier swallow her hope forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mining camp's snow-covered street as Penelope Harding stumbled forward, tears freezing on her cheeks. The thin white sheet from the laundry line was all that covered her shivering form as she desperately tried to wrap it tighter against the biting cold. Fluffy snowflakes drifted down, settling on her bare shoulders and melting against her flushed skin. "Please," she whimpered, her bare feet burning with each step in the deep snow. "I have nowhere to go." The crowd that had gathered outside the boarding house showed no mercy. Rough-looking miners and townsmen jeered, their cruel laughter echoing off the weathered wooden buildings. "Look at that useless fat girl," one man called out, triggering another round of harsh chuckles. "Can't even earn her keep," another added, spitting into the snow. Penelope's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled forward, the sheet trailing in the woe, snow behind her. The boarding house matron had thrown her out with nothing but what she wore, not even allowing her to gather her few precious possessions, Tanju, the books her parents had left her, the small tin of coins she'd saved, or even her shoes. "They kicked me out naked," she cried out, her voice breaking. The words caught in her throat as she collapsed to her knees in the snow, the sheet pooling around her. The cold bit deep into her bones, and she could no longer feel her feet. The crowd's laughter grew louder, more mocking. Someone threw a clump of dirty snow that struck her shoulder, making her flinch. Penelope hung her head, hot tears streaming down her face as she waited for the next cruel blow. Instead, she heard the steady clip-clop of hooves approaching through the snow. The jeering crowd fell quiet, and Penelope looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a tall figure on horseback. The man's broad shoulders were wrapped in a worn leather coat, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, snorted and stamped in the snow, creating small clouds of steam in the frigid air. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached her. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy buffalo hide coat and draped it gently around her shoulders. The warmth of it seeped into her frozen skin, and she caught the scent of wood smoke and pine needles. "Get on my horse now," his deep voice commanded, brooking no argument. His tone was firm but not unkind, and Penelope found herself responding to the authority in it despite her fear. The crowd had fallen completely silent, watching as this mountain man, for surely that's what he was, with his buckskin-clad legs and wild beard, helped Penelope to her feet. His hands were strong but gentle as he lifted her, mindful of her modesty as he made sure the buffalo coat covered her completely. Penelope's teeth chattered as she looked up at his face. Dark eyes met hers, filled with a quiet intensity that made her catch her breath. A scar ran along his jaw, partially hidden by his beard, speaking of a life lived rough in the wilderness. Yet there was something in his expression, a flicker of compassion, that gave her courage. "I'm Luca McBride. Redid Prussia, to Prussia, redid Clater land. Luca McBride," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Let's get you somewhere safe." He helped her mount his horse, his strong hands steady as he lifted her onto the saddle. Penelope clutched the buffalo coat tighter around herself, still trembling but now from more than just the cold. The horse shifted beneath her, and she gripped the saddle horn with white-knucked fingers. Luca swung up behind her in one smooth motion, reaching around her to gather the reins. His presence was solid and warm at her back, and Penelope found herself leaning slightly into that warmth, seeking shelter from more than just the winter wind. "Hold steady now," he murmured, and clicked to his horse. The bay responded immediately, turning away from the silent crowd and walking steadily through the deepening snow. As they rode away from the mining camp, Penelope could hear the whispers starting behind them, the sound of gossip beginning to spread, like wildfire through dry timber. But for the first time since being thrown out, she didn't care what they were saying about her. The snow continued to fall as they left the town behind, big flakes drifting down in the gathering dusk. Penelope's bare feet, tucked against the horse's warm sides, slowly began to regain feeling, bringing with them sharp pins and needles of pain. She bit her lip to keep from making a sound, but Luca seemed to sense her discomfort. "Not much further," he said, his voice rumbling against her back. "I've got a cabin just over that ridge. We'll get you warm and properly clothed." Penelope nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The events of the day crashed over her, the boarding house matron's accusations, the brutal eviction, the public humiliation, and now this unexpected rescue. She began to shake, not from cold but from delayed shock. Luca's arm tightened slightly around her waist, steadying her. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." The simple words, spoken with such quiet certainty, broke something loose inside her. Tears began to fall again, but these were different from the bitter ones she'd shed in town. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the realization that someone had finally seen her suffering and stepped in to help. The bay horse picked its way carefully along what seemed to be a trail, though Penelope could hardly see it under the snow. The mining camp disappeared behind them as they entered the forest, the snowflakes now filtering down through pine boughs. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves in snow, the horse's steady breathing, and the occasional soft creak of leather from the saddle. Penelope found herself relaxing slightly, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's walk and the solid presence behind her. The buffalo coat was incredibly warm, and the worst of her shivering had subsided. She caught herself beginning to drift, exhaustion pulling at her, and forced her eyes open. "I don't even know how to thank you," she whispered, breaking the long silence. "No need," Luca replied simply. "Couldn't leave you there like that. Wasn't right." His words were few but sincere, and Penelope felt fresh tears prick at her eyes at the basic humanity of it. After months of being treated as less than human by the boarding house matron, after being mocked and scorned for her size, after having her inheritance stolen through manipulation and lies, this stranger had shown her more kindness in a few minutes than she'd experienced since her parents' deaths. The sound of the horse's hooves changed, becoming more hollow, and Penelope realized they were crossing a small wooden bridge over a half-frozen stream. Through the falling snow, she could make out the dark shape of a cabin ahead, smoke rising from its stone chimney into the winter sky. "Home," Luca said simply, guiding his horse toward the cabin's front door. The word echoed in Penelope's heart, bringing with it a surge of hope she hardly dared to acknowledge. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was safe, she was warm, and she had been shown kindness by a stranger who asked nothing in return. As Luca helped her down from the horse, his strong hands gentle on her waist, Penelope caught a glimpse of his face in the gathering dusk. There was something in his eyes, a shadow of old pain that matched the scar on his jaw, that made her wonder what story had brought him to this solitary life in the mountains. But that was a question for another time. For now, she followed him toward the cabin's door, the buffalo coat wrapped tight around her shoulders, leaving the shame and cruelty of the mining camp behind in the falling snow. The mountain path wound higher through the gathering dusk, snow falling thick and silent around them. Luca's horse picked its way carefully along the trail, hooves crunching through fresh powder. The temperature dropped steadily as they climbed, and Penelope huddled deeper into the buffalo coat, grateful for its warmth but unable to stop her violent shivering. "I'm sorry," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I haven't even proper shoes." Her bare feet, tucked against the horse's warm flanks, had gone mostly numb, which was perhaps a blessing considering how they'd burned with cold earlier. Luca's voice came from behind her, low and steady. "Your feet? They're bare?" There was a note of concern in his tone that made fresh tears spring to Penelope's eyes. "Yes," she admitted. They didn't give me time to dress, just threw me out with nothing but this sheet." She clutched the thin white fabric that was still tangled with the buffalo coat, remembering the cruel laughter of the crowd. "Family nearby?" Luca asked after a long moment. Penelope shook her head, watching snowflakes catch in the horse's dark mane. "No, sir. My parents. They passed 3 years ago. I came west with my inheritance, but—" She swallowed hard, unable to continue as memories of the boarding house matron's manipulation surfaced. Luca didn't press for more. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the reins, urging the horse to maintain its steady pace despite the deepening snow. The path grew steeper, winding between tall pines whose branches hung heavy with white. Wind gusted occasionally, sending swirls of snow between the trees and causing Penelope to shrink back against Luca's solid presence. As they climbed, the mining camp disappeared entirely behind them, swallowed by the storm and the gathering darkness. Penelope found herself holding her breath at times, straining to see through the whirling snow. Just when she thought she couldn't bear the cold any longer, Luca spoke again. "Cabins just ahead." Through the curtain of white, Penelope made out a dark shape among the trees. As they drew closer, details emerged. Rough-hewn logs stacked and chinked with mud, a steep roof now thick with snow, and a stone chimney rising from one end. It wasn't a large cabin, but it looked solid and well-maintained, with split firewood stacked neatly along one wall under an overhanging roof. Luca guided the horse right up to the cabin's door, then dismounted in one fluid motion. His boots crunched in the fresh snow as he reached up to help Penelope down. She tried to stand when her feet touched the ground, but her legs had gone stiff from cold and fear. She stumbled, and would have fallen if not for Luca's quick hands catching her elbows. "Easy now," he murmured, supporting her weight until she found her balance. "Let's get you inside." The cabin door opened with a creak of leather hinges, revealing darkness beyond. Luca helped Penelope across the threshold, then immediately moved to the stone fireplace. His hands worked quickly, arranging kindling and striking a match. Within moments, a small flame caught and began to grow. As warmth slowly filled the single room, Penelope took in her surroundings. The cabin was simply furnished but neat. A narrow bed occupied one corner, its quilts tucked military tight. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood near the fireplace, and shelves lined one wall, holding provisions and what looked like leather-bound journals. Everything spoke of a solitary life, lived with care and order. "Sit," Luca said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Need to see to the horse first." He disappeared outside, leaving the door firmly closed against the storm. Penelope sank into the chair, still wrapped in the buffalo coat. The fire's warmth began to reach her, and with it came the first painful tingles in her feet as feeling returned. She bit her lip, trying not to cry out at the sensation. When Luca returned, snow dusting his shoulders, he moved straight to a pot hanging near the fireplace. "Broth still warm from morning," he said, ladling some into a tin cup. He handed it to Penelope, who took it with trembling hands. The rich smell of beef and vegetables rose with the steam, making Penelope's stomach clench with hunger. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. The broth tasted better than anything she could remember, warming her from the inside out. While she sipped, Luca rummaged in a trunk near the bed. He returned with thick wool socks and a heavy blanket, setting them beside her without ceremony. "For your feet," he said simply, "once you've finished the broth." Penelope stared at the simple items, and suddenly everything overwhelmed her. The cruel jeering of the crowd, the terror of being thrown out nearly naked into the snow, the unexpected kindness of this stranger who asked nothing in return. Tears spilled down her cheeks as sobs shook her body. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I don't mean to be a burden. I don't know what I'll do, where I'll go." The cup rattled in her hands, and Luca gently took it before she could spill the remaining broth. "You'll freeze out there," he said matter-of-factly, setting the cup on the table. His voice was quiet but firm. "Here, you'll be safe." The simple statement, delivered without judgment or expectation, only made Penelope cry harder. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking as all the fear and shame of the day poured out of her. Through her tears, she was dimly aware of Luca moving around the cabin, adding wood to the fire, hanging his snow-dusted coat by the door. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Penelope found herself exhausted. The fire had built up to a steady blaze, filling the cabin with warmth and the comforting sounds of crackling wood. Outside, the wind had risen, howling around the cabin's corners and rattling the shuttered windows. With hands that still trembled slightly, Penelope pulled on the wool socks. They were far too big, clearly Luca's, but the soft warmth was heaven on her abused feet. She wrapped the blanket around herself over the buffalo coat, creating a cocoon of warmth. Luca sat at the table now, his face unreadable in the firelight. He didn't speak or stare, simply maintained a quiet presence that somehow made Penelope feel both safe and uncertain. Who was this man who had shown such kindness to a stranger? What had brought him to this solitary life in the mountains? The question swirled in her mind, but exhaustion pulled at her more strongly with each passing moment. The fire's warmth and the sound of the storm outside created a drowsy atmosphere that was impossible to resist after the terrors of the day. Penelope found herself curling up near the hearth, using her arm as a pillow. The last thing she saw before her eyes drifted closed was Luca's silent figure at the table, his face turned toward the fire, lost in thoughts she couldn't begin to guess. The storm raged outside, but within the cabin's walls, Penelope had found an unexpected sanctuary. Sleep took her quickly, deep and dreamless, while her unlikely protector kept watch in the flickering firelight. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, casting golden beams across the rough wooden floor. Penelope stirred from her place near the hearth, where Luca had arranged blankets into a makeshift bed the night before. The fire had burned low, but the cabin remained surprisingly warm. Luca was already up, his tall frame silhouetted against the window as he pulled on his heavy coat. "Storm's past," he said, noticing she was awake. "Need to show you around if you're staying." Penelope sat up slowly, smoothing her tangled hair with nervous fingers. The events of yesterday felt almost like a dream, but her bare feet in borrowed wool socks told the truth of it. "I don't want to be any trouble," she began. "Ain't trouble to know where things are," Luca cut in, his voice matter-of-fact. He handed her a spare coat from a peg by the door. "Put this on. Snow's deep." The coat nearly swallowed her, but Penelope was grateful for its warmth as they stepped outside. The world had transformed overnight into a glittering expanse of white. Fresh snow lay thick on every surface, and the morning sun made it sparkle like scattered diamonds. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine. "Spring house first," Luca said, breaking a path through the knee-deep snow. Penelope followed in his footsteps, trying to keep up despite the deep drifts. A small structure stood about 50 paces from the main cabin, built partially into the hillside. Inside, the spring house was cool and dim. A clear stream bubbled up through the stone floor, flowing through a shallow channel before disappearing back into the earth. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding crocks of butter, cheese, and salted meat. "Water's good for drinking," Luca explained. "Keeps food cool in summer, too." He showed her where the water bucket hung and how to dip it without muddying the spring. Back outside, they moved to a lean-to shelter attached to the cabin's side. Tools hung in neat rows, axes, saws, traps, and implements Penelope didn't recognize. Luca named each one, explaining its purpose with patient thoroughness. "Most important right now is keeping warm," he said, leading her to the woodpile. "Need to bring in enough for day and night both." Luca demonstrated how to judge which logs would fit the fireplace, then lifted several into his arms with practiced ease. Penelope watched carefully, then stepped forward to try herself. She managed to grip one large log, but its weight made her arms shake. When she tried to lift a second, the first one slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thump in the snow. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she heard Luca set his own arm load down. "I'm sorry," she stammered, fighting back tears of frustration. "I know I'm not very strong, but I can be useful, I promise. I just need to learn." "No shame in starting small," Luca said quietly. He moved to another part of the woodpile and pulled out thinner pieces of split wood. "Try these first. Kindling's just as important as big logs." Penelope gathered the smaller pieces, finding she could carry several at once. Though the load was lighter, she felt a small surge of pride at managing it successfully. Luca nodded approvingly as she stacked the kindling neatly by the fireplace. They worked together for the next hour, Luca carrying the heavy logs while Penelope handled the smaller wood and helped arrange everything inside. When they finished, Luca showed her how to use the splitting maul to make more kindling from larger pieces. "Stand like this," he demonstrated, positioning his feet. "Let the weight of the maul do the work, don't force it." Penelope's first few attempts barely dented the wood, but Luca remained patient. He adjusted her grip, showed her where to aim. On her fifth try, the piece split cleanly in two. The sound of success was deeply satisfying. "Well done," Luca said simply, but his approval made Penelope stand a little straighter. By mid-morning, Luca had a pot of stew heating over the fire. The rich aroma filled the cabin as they sat at the rough table, steam rising from their bowls. Penelope found herself hungry despite her lingering anxiety about her situation. After several quiet spoonfuls, she gathered her courage. "I should explain. About yesterday." Her fingers twisted in her lap. "My parents, they died 3 years ago. Fever took them both within days of each other." Luca set his spoon down, giving her his full attention. "They left me a small inheritance," Penelope continued. "Not much, but enough to start fresh somewhere. I chose to come west because I thought, well, I hoped people might judge me less here." She gestured vaguely at herself, her struggles with her weight a constant shadow. "When I arrived at the boarding house, Mrs. Thorne seemed so kind at first. She said she'd help me invest my money, make it grow." Penelope's voice caught. "I trusted her, signed papers without reading them carefully enough. Then yesterday, she said I'd signed everything over to her. That I owed her for room and board, and since I couldn't pay, she threw you out," Luca finished, his voice hard. "With nothing." Penelope nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I know I was foolish to trust her, but I never thought." "Fraud," Luca said flatly. "That's what it was. Proper law would call it that too." His hands tightened on his spoon, and Penelope saw anger flash in his usually calm eyes. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. As Penelope helped clear the bowls, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of Luca's shirt. "I could mend that for you," she offered hesitantly. "If you have needle and thread?" Luca looked surprised but nodded toward a small box on one of the shelves. Inside, Penelope found basic sewing supplies, needle, thread, scissors, and a few buttons. She settled near the window where the light was best and began working on the torn sleeve. Her stitches were tiny and even, years of practice evident in their neat precision. She had always found peace in sewing, and the familiar motion of needle and thread helped calm her troubled thoughts. When she finished, the repair was nearly invisible. Luca examined the mended sleeve with careful attention. "Fine work," he said, sounding impressed despite himself. Haven't had proper mending done since. He stopped abruptly, something dark passing across his face. Penelope didn't press him. She understood about painful memories, about things better left unsaid. Instead, she gathered a few more torn items from the mending pile she'd spotted. It felt good to have a way to repay some of Luca's kindness, even in this small way. The rest of the day passed quietly. Luca showed her more about the cabin's daily routine, how to bank the fire to last through the night, where to find the basic supplies she might need. Penelope listened carefully to every instruction, determined to learn and be useful. As evening approached, she found herself watching Luca as he moved about his tasks. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke clearly enough. Everything he did showed care and consideration. Not for his home, his tools, and now, unexpectedly, for her. Trust, Penelope realized, was like the kindling she'd learned to split that morning. It started small, but with patience and the right technique, it could grow into something strong enough to warm them both. 2 days passed in a gentle rhythm of small tasks and careful learning. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Penelope made her way to the spring house, carrying 2 wooden buckets. She had already memorized the path Luca showed her, carefully placing her borrowed boots in the packed snow of previous footprints. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine. Penelope paused to adjust her grip on the buckets, grateful for the warm woolen shawl Luca had found for her in an old trunk. It wasn't much, but it was better than the thin dress she'd arrived in. As she approached the spring house, a sound caught her attention, the distant crunch of horse hooves in snow. Her heart jumped. No one had visited since she'd arrived. She set down her buckets and peered around the corner of the small stone building. A rider was approaching up the narrow mountain trail, his horse picking its way carefully through the deep snow. The man sat straight in his saddle, and even from a distance, the silver star on his chest caught the sunlight. Penelope's stomach clenched with sudden fear. She hurried back to the cabin, nearly slipping in her haste. Luca was checking his trap lines, but he'd said he wouldn't go far. "Luca," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's a lawman coming." Luca emerged from the tree line, his rifle slung across his back. He moved to stand beside her on the cabin's small porch, his expression wary but composed. Together they watched the rider approach. The deputy marshal drew his horse to a stop in the cleared space before the cabin. He was a lean man with graying hair beneath his hat, his face weathered but clean-shaven. His badge identified him as Deputy Marshal Callahan. "Morning," Callahan said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes moved between Luca and Penelope, assessing. "Mind if I step down?" "Got some business to discuss." Luca nodded once, his face unreadable. Callahan dismounted smoothly, tying his horse to a nearby post. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the porch. "Word travels fast in mining country," Callahan began, his tone professionally neutral. "Heard there was some trouble at Widow Thorne's boarding house few days back. Young lady leaving under unusual circumstances." His gaze settled on Penelope, who fought the urge to shrink behind Luca. "She was thrown out with nothing but a sheet," Luca said, his voice hard. "In freezing weather," Callahan nodded slowly. "So I heard. Also heard from Widow Thorne herself yesterday. Claims there's more to the story." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. "According to her, Miss Harding here is what the law calls a dependent ward, someone whose affairs are managed by another party. In this case, through legal documents regarding her inheritance." Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. "But she tricked me," she protested, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't understand what I was signing." "That may be so," Callahan said, not unkindly. "But until it's proven otherwise, those papers stand. Which brings me to you, McBride." He turned to face Luca directly. "Keeping a dependent ward without legal authority. That's what we call harboring. Serious offense." Luca's shoulders stiffened. You suggesting I should have left her to freeze? No, Callahan said. But now that you're informed of the situation, continuing to shelter her without proper documentation could lead to arrest. He paused, letting that sink in. However, I'm not unreasonable. You've got 1 week to present proof of Miss Harding's claim at the county courthouse. Show the fraud, if fraud there was, and this all goes away. Penelope's legs felt weak. 1 week to prove what had been stolen from her, when she had nothing, not even the clothes on her back? She grabbed the porch railing for support, feeling tears threaten. And if we can't? Luca's voice was dangerously quiet. Then Miss Harding returns to her legal guardian's custody, and you face charges. Callahan tucked his notebook away. 1 week from today, court opens at 9 o'clock sharp. He touched his hat again and returned to his horse. They watched him mount up and turn back down the trail, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared among the trees. Penelope's hands were shaking. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. If you want me to go with him now. No, Luca's response was immediate and firm. He turned to face her, his eyes intense. We'll find the truth. No one owns you, Penelope. Not Widow Thorne, not anyone. But how? Tears spilled over despite her efforts to hold them back. I have no proof, no papers, nothing. Then we'll look for proof. Luca's voice held quiet determination. Talk to people who might have seen something. Find others she might have cheated. Truth leaves traces, if you know where to look. Penelope wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. You'd do that? Risk so much for someone you barely know? Luca was silent for a long moment, looking out over the snow-covered valley. Know enough, he finally said. Know you're honest. Know you're trying. That's worth fighting for. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, steadying her. She straightened her shoulders, trying to find courage in his certainty. Thank you, she said softly. I'll do whatever I can to help. They spent the rest of the day making plans. Luca knew people in nearby settlements who might have helpful information. They would need to ride into town tomorrow, begin asking questions. The thought of facing those who had mocked her made Penelope's stomach twist, but she refused to let fear stop her. That evening, after Luca had banked the fire and retired to his small back room, Penelope knelt beside her makeshift bed near the hearth. The cabin was quiet except for the soft pop of cooling embers and the distant cry of a night bird. Lord, she whispered, clasping her hands tightly. I know I've asked for so much already. Your protection, your guidance. But please, give me strength for what's ahead. Help me find the truth. And, she hesitated, glancing toward Luca's closed door. Please protect those who've shown me kindness. Don't let my troubles bring them harm. She remained kneeling for several minutes, drawing comfort from the familiar ritual of prayer. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she wasn't facing them alone. She had Luca's support, and more importantly, she had her faith. As she finally lay down, pulling the blankets close around her, Penelope thought about Deputy Marshal Callahan's words. 1 week to prove her claim, 1 week to reclaim her life and future, 1 week to ensure Luca wouldn't suffer for his generosity. It seemed impossible, yet she had to try. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind in the pines outside. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, she was safe, she was warm, and she had hope. It would have to be enough. Dawn brought bitter cold that seeped through the cabin's log walls. Penelope woke to find frost patterns decorating the inside of the window panes, delicate as lace. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing embers. Luca was already up, his heavy boots thudding softly on the wooden floor as he moved about the cabin. She heard him adding logs to the fire, the sharp crack of kindling breaking the morning silence. We need supplies, he said, when she sat up, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders. And information. I've got a sled we can hitch to the horse. Penelope's heart quickened at the thought of returning to town, but she nodded. I want to help prepare for the journey. It'll be cold work, Luca warned, studying her face. I'm stronger than I look, she replied, lifting her chin. The past few days of handling firewood and fetching water had already begun toughening her hands. They ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of Luca's molasses. Afterward, Penelope pulled on the spare wool socks Luca had given her, layering them inside the 2 large boots he'd found in a trunk. They weren't a perfect fit, but they were better than going barefoot. Outside, the morning air bit at her face like tiny needles. Her breath formed thick clouds in front of her as she helped Luca drag the wooden sled from beneath the lean-to where he stored it. The sled's runners were solid, though, weathered, and rope crosses created a sturdy bed for cargo. Hold this steady, Luca instructed, showing her where to grip while he checked the runners and bindings. His movements were practiced, efficient. Used to use this for hauling game and firewood before I got the horse. Penelope's fingers grew numb despite her borrowed mittens, but she held on without complaint. When Luca finished his inspection, she helped him attach the sled to his horse's harness with heavy leather straps. You'll ride, he said, adjusting the stirrups on his saddle. I'll walk alongside and lead. But Penelope started to protest. No arguments, Luca cut in, his tone gentle but firm. Trails treacherous with ice under the snow. Rather have you up there than risk a fall. The logic was sound, but Penelope still felt guilty as Luca helped her mount. She was conscious of her weight, wondering if she was too heavy a burden for the horse. But the sturdy animal showed no sign of strain, standing patiently as Luca gathered the reins. They set off slowly down the mountain trail, Luca keeping a steady hand on the horse's bridle. The sled's runners cut clean tracks through the fresh snow, sliding easily in their wake. Around them, the forest was silent except for the occasional snap of an ice-laden branch and the soft crunch of Luca's boots. As they descended, Penelope found herself studying Luca's profile. His face was weathered by years in the elements, lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. But there was something noble in the set of his jaw, something trustworthy in the way he moved with such quiet purpose. The town came into view by mid-morning, smoke rising from chimneys against the cold blue sky. Penelope's stomach tightened as they approached. Already, she could see people stopping to stare, could hear the whispers starting. Look who's back. McBride's charity case. That fat girl from the boarding house. The words carried clearly in the winter air. Penelope fought, the urge to hunch down in the saddle, forcing herself to sit straight despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Luca's hand tightened on the reins, but his pace remained steady as they made their way down the main street. Men lounging outside the saloon pointed and snickered. Women gathering at the well drew back, heads together in obvious gossip. A group of children started to mock until their teacher sharply called them inside. Hold your head high, Luca murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Their words can't touch you unless you let them. They reached the general store, its windows frosted around the edges. Luca helped Penelope dismount, then tied the horse and sled to the hitching post. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The shopkeeper, Mr. Peterson, gave them a neutral nod as they entered. Other customers browsed the shelves, some openly staring while pretending not to. Luca began gathering supplies: naan, flour, coffee, salt pork, matches, while Penelope followed with a basket. Then a familiar voice cut through the quiet store, making Penelope freeze in place. "Oh yes, I have all the papers in hand." Widow Thorne's satisfied tone carried from near the counter. "Legal documentation of guardianship, signed and witnessed. That girl hasn't a leg to stand on." Penelope's hands began to shake. The basket nearly slipped from her grip until Luca's steady fingers caught it, taking it from her gently. "Wait outside," he said softly. "I'll finish here." But Penelope couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the floor as Widow Thorne's voice continued. "Really, it's for her own good. She clearly can't manage on her own. Look how she threw herself at the first man who'd take her in. No. The court will see reason. They always do when proper papers are presented. The room started to spin. Penelope felt the familiar panic rising, the same helplessness that had overwhelmed her when she'd first realized how thoroughly she'd been deceived. But then Luca's hand was at her elbow, steering her firmly toward the door. "We don't fight with fear," he said once they were outside in the clear winter air. "We fight with truth." Penelope drew in deep breaths, letting the cold fill her lungs. "But she has papers, real papers. What if papers can lie?" Luca interrupted. "Truth stays truth, no matter what's written down." He finished loading their supplies onto the sled while Penelope stood watching, trying to still her trembling hands. When everything was secured, he helped her back into the saddle, and they began the long climb home. The sun was high now, making the snow blindingly bright. They were perhaps halfway up the mountain when Luca began to speak, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness. "Had a wife once," he said, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Sarah. She was carrying our first child when fever took them both." Penelope's heart caught at the pain in his voice. She remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "Bitterness ate at me after that. Couldn't stand to be around people. Their pity, their well-meaning words. Moved up here, lived alone, trapped, hunted, kept to myself." He paused, adjusting the horse's lead rope. 5 years now. "I'm so sorry," Penelope whispered. Luca shook his head. "Not telling you for pity. Telling you because I know something about letting dark thoughts win. About letting shame and anger build walls." He looked up at her then, his eyes intense. "Don't let them silence you, Penelope. Don't let their mockery win." Something warm unfurled in Penelope's chest, pushing back against the cold fear that had gripped her in the store. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it was to face darkness alone. Yet he'd chosen to help her, to share his shelter and now his pain. "I won't," she promised, both to him and herself. "I won't let them win." They continued up the mountain in comfortable silence, the sled's runners, whispering through the snow behind them. Penelope felt a new resolve building within her, stronger than her fear of Widow Thorne's papers, stronger than her shame at the town's mockery. The truth was worth fighting for, and she was no longer fighting alone. The cabin welcomed them back from their difficult journey to town, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd banked the morning's fire. Penelope helped Luca unload the sled, carrying lighter items while he handled the heavier sacks. Her arms ached, but she was determined to do her part. Inside, she immediately went to stoke the fire, adding small pieces of kindling until the flames danced higher. The familiar motions calmed her after the day's tensions. Without asking, she began unpacking their supplies, organizing them on the rough wooden shelves. "Let me fix us something to eat," she said, noticing how Luca's shoulders sagged with fatigue. "You've done enough today." He started to protest, but she was already reaching for the flour sack. "Please, it's one thing I know I can do well." Luca settled into a chair, watching as she worked. Penelope moved with quiet confidence around the small cooking area, measuring flour by eye into a wooden bowl. Her hands knew this dance, adding a pinch of salt, cutting in lard with 2 knives, working quickly before the fire's heat could warm the fat too much. "My mama taught me her biscuit recipe when I was just tall enough to reach the table," she said, sprinkling cold water and gathering the dough. "Said a woman who could make good biscuits would never go hungry." She shaped the dough with practiced movements, placing each round carefully in the cast iron skillet. While they baked, she started a stew with salt pork, dried beans, and the last of the previous season's root vegetables from Luca's storage cellar. The cabin slowly filled with warmth and savory aromas. Luca remained silent, but his eyes followed her movements. When she finally placed a plate before him, golden biscuits and steaming stew, he stared at it for a long moment. Been a while since I had proper home cooking, he said quietly, breaking open a biscuit. Steam rose from its fluffy center. He took a bite, and something in his expression shifted, softened. These taste like… He paused, swallowing hard. Like home used to be. Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding the weight of that simple statement. She busied herself with her own plate, giving him time to compose himself. After they'd eaten, Luca surprised her by saying, "Tomorrow I'll teach you about trapping. Rabbit meat would go good in that stew." "Me?" Penelope blinked. "I don't know the first thing about trapping. Everyone starts somewhere." He stood, gathering their empty plates. "Besides, you showed me your skill today. Time I shared some of mine." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Luca led Penelope into the woods behind the cabin, carrying several metal traps and a length of wire. He moved quietly, pointing out tracks in the snow, the delicate prints of rabbits, the broader marks of deer. "See here?" He knelt, indicating a well-worn path through the underbrush. "Rabbits use the same trails over and over. That's where we set the traps." He demonstrated how to position the trap, explaining each step carefully. Penelope watched intently, determined to learn. When it was her turn to try, her cold fingers fumbled with the mechanism. "Take your time," Luca encouraged. "Better to set it right than set it fast." Finally, she managed to place one correctly. They set several more, Penelope growing more confident with each attempt. By the time they finished, her dress was muddy from kneeling in the snow, but she felt a deep satisfaction. "Now we wait," Luca said as they headed back to the cabin. "Check them tomorrow morning." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Penelope noticed a worn Bible on Luca's shelf. Dust had settled thick on its leather cover. "Would you read something?" she asked softly. "I miss hearing the word." Luca stared at the Bible for a long moment. Then, slowly, he rose and took it down, wiping off the dust with his sleeve. The pages crackled as he opened it, stiff from disuse. "Used to read this every night," he said, his voice rough. "Haven't touched it since Sarah," he trailed off, but Penelope understood. "Start anywhere," she encouraged. "The Lord's words are always new." Luca cleared his throat and began to read from Psalms. His deep voice gave weight to the ancient words of comfort and hope. Penelope closed her eyes, letting the familiar verses wash over her. When he finished, she noticed an old journal beside his chair. "May I?" she asked, reaching for it. He nodded, and she opened it carefully. Most pages were filled with brief notes about weather, game movements, and supplies. But there were empty pages in the back. Taking up a pencil, Penelope began copying the verses Luca had just read, her handwriting neat and clear. Below them, she added others she remembered, promises of God's faithfulness, of light in darkness. Luca watched her write, something stirring in his expression. When she finished, he took the journal, running his fingers over the careful script. "Been so long," he murmured. "Sometimes forgot these promises were still there." "They always are," Penelope said gently, "even when we can't see them through our pain." The next morning, they checked the traps together. To Penelope's delight, one had sprung successfully. A plump rabbit lay caught, providing their next meal. "You did this," Luca said, showing her how to reset the trap. "Your trap, your catch." Despite her muddied dress and cold hands, Penelope felt a surge of pride. She'd contributed something real to their survival. More than that, she'd helped bring light back into Luca's eyes through the simple act of sharing faith. That evening, without prompting, Luca reached for the Bible again. As he read, Penelope added more verses to his journal, their shared quiet broken only by the crackling fire and his steady voice speaking ancient words of hope. The walls of solitude Luca had built around himself began to crack, letting in warmth he'd long forgotten. And Penelope, who'd feared she would always be a burden, found herself becoming something more, a partner in survival, a light in darkness, a keeper of faith. Together, they created something neither had expected to find in the cold mountain winter. HMAD, a home where hope could grow. The mountain winter settled into a comforting rhythm at Luca's cabin. Each morning, Penelope rose before dawn to stoke the dying embers, adding kindling piece by piece until warmth returned to the small space. The routine of survival became familiar, almost peaceful. On this particular afternoon, sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the plank floor. Penelope had finished the morning's tasks early, the dishes washed, fresh bread cooling on the table, and a pot of beans simmering for supper. Luca was outside, the steady thunk of his axe marking time as he split more firewood. Her eyes drifted to the battered trunk in the corner. The boarding house matron had tossed it out after her, claiming it held nothing but worthless scraps. Until now, Penelope hadn't had the heart to sort through the painful reminders of her humiliation. Might as well face it, she murmured to herself, pulling the trunk closer to the firelight. The brass clasp was tarnished but opened easily. Inside lay a jumble of cast-offs, a torn shawl, mismatched buttons, and scraps of fabric she'd saved for mending. Her fingers trembled as she lifted each item, memories rising like dust. Near the bottom, wrapped in a faded piece of muslin, she found something unexpected, a thick bundle of letters tied with twine. "What's this?" She turned the package over, her breath catching at the familiar handwriting on the topmost envelope. Papa's letters? The seal on the first envelope was unbroken. She cracked the brittle wax carefully, unfolding pages she'd never seen before. Her father's bold script filled the paper. "My dearest daughter Penelope, I write this as my final provision for your future. Enclosed you will find the deed to our riverfront timber claim, 300 acres of prime land along the Colorado. This legacy is yours alone, to be held in trust until your 18th birthday." Penelope's hands shook so badly she could barely read the rest. Tucked inside was another document, official-looking with elaborate script and courthouse seals. The deed, just as her father had written, granting her full rights to the timber claim. "Luca," her voice cracked as she called out. "Luca, please come quick." The sound of chopping stopped. Heavy boots crossed the porch, and Luca burst through the door, still gripping his axe. "What's wrong?" "Look." Penelope thrust the papers toward him, tears streaming down her face. "My father's letters, they were here all along. And the deed to his timber claim." Luca set down his axe and took the documents carefully, moving closer to the window to read. His expression grew increasingly serious as he studied the legal language. "This is why," he said finally, his voice tight with anger. "This is why that woman kept you trapped at the boarding house. This land." He stopped, taking a deep breath. "Penelope, do you know what riverfront timber rights are worth these days?" She shook her head, dabbing at her tears with her apron. "The railroad's buying up every stand of timber they can find. They need ties for the tracks, lumber for bridges and stations." He handed the deed back reverently. "This could be worth a small fortune, more than enough to build a proper homestead, run a working ranch." "A homestead?" Penelope whispered the word like a prayer. "You mean, I could have a real home?" "We could," Luca said softly, then seemed startled by his own words. A flush crept up his neck. "That is, if you wanted, if you'd consider." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up at him, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning. "I know I ain't much," Luca continued gruffly, staring at his rough hands. "Just a mountain man with too many hard years behind him. But watching you these past days, your strength, your faith, the way you've made this cabin feel like home again." He swallowed hard. "I reckon I'm asking if you might want to build that homestead together." Joy bubbled up in Penelope's chest, threatening to overflow. "You truly mean that?" "Never meant anything more in my life." His eyes met hers, full of earnest warmth. "We could start fresh. both of us. Build something good on that land of yours. Our land, Penelope corrected softly. She reached for his calloused hand, squeezing it gently. And yes, I'd want nothing more than to build a home with you. Luca's fingers tightened around hers. For a long moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam between them. The future seemed to shimmer with possibility. We should check the exact location, Luca said finally, practical even in this tender moment. He crossed to his shelf and pulled down a battered map. They spread it on the table, and he traced the river's course with his finger. Your father was smart, claiming this bend. Good water access, sheltered valley for grazing, even a natural clearing for buildings. Penelope leaned close, trying to imagine it. Could we plant an orchard? Maybe raise some chickens? Anything you want. Luca's voice was rough with emotion. We could build a proper house with glass windows. Maybe even add a schoolroom someday, so you could teach like you've talked about. It seems almost too wonderful to be true. Penelope pressed her hand to her heart, where hope fluttered like a wild thing. After everything, to find not just the deed but a future too. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Luca quoted softly, surprising her. It was the first time he'd spoken of faith without prompting. He does indeed. Penelope picked up the bundle of letters, holding them close. Papa always said he'd provide for me. Even after he was gone, he kept his word. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, heads bent together over the map. Luca's practical knowledge merged with Penelope's dreams as they sketched out buildings, discussed crop rotations, and imagined the seasons turning over their own land. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their improvised plans, Penelope felt a deep sense of rightness settle in her soul. This was more than just regaining her inheritance, it was finding her place in the world, alongside someone who saw her true worth. We'll need to ride to the courthouse tomorrow, Luca said, rolling up the map carefully. Get these papers recorded proper and legal before that boarding house witch can cause more trouble. Penelope nodded, gathering up the precious letters and deed. I'm not afraid anymore, she realized aloud. Not with you beside me. Won't let anyone hurt you again, Luca promised quietly. His hand found hers across the table, warm and strong. This is our chance for a fresh start, both of us, and by God's grace, we'll make the most of it. The evening settled around them like a blessing. Outside, snow began to fall softly. But the cabin was warm with more than just firelight. Hope blazed between them, bright as any flame, illuminating the path ahead. That night, as Penelope added another entry to Luca's journal, she copied out a verse that seemed written just for them. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. She looked up to find Luca watching her with gentle eyes, and knew in her heart that they had already found that future together. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines as Luca stepped onto the cabin's front porch, steam rising from his coffee cup. Something caught his eye, a disturbance in the fresh snow near the woodpile. He set down his cup and moved closer, his weathered face turning grave. Boot prints. Not his own broad tracks, but narrower ones made by city shoes. Multiple sets, circling the cabin. Penelope, he called softly through the open door. Come, look at this. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face paled as she saw what Luca was studying. When were they here? Last night, I reckon. Luca traced the edge of one print with his finger. Snows settled in them some, but not filled. Must have been after midnight. He straightened, scanning the tree line. 3 men, maybe 4. They stayed back in the shadows, watching. Penelope hugged herself against more than just the morning chill. Because of the deed? Has to be. News travels fast in small towns. Luca's jaw tightened. Someone must have seen us finding it yesterday. Inside the cabin, they spread the precious documents on the table again. Penelope's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the deed's creased corners. "What should we do?" "We need to get this recorded at the courthouse," Luca said firmly. "But we'll have to be careful. Those tracks mean trouble's brewing." In town that very moment, trouble was indeed taking shape in the boarding house parlor. Sarah Blackwood, the establishment's proprietor, poured coffee for her early morning visitor with hands that shook with barely contained rage. 300 acres of prime riverfront timber, she spat. That stupid girl had no idea what she was sitting on all this time. She slammed the coffee pot down. "And now she's found the deed." Railroad agent James Morton sipped his coffee carefully, his neat suit and polished boots marking him as an outsider in the rough mining town. "This complicates things considerably, Mrs. Blackwood. The railroad needs that tract for the new line. We can't have some mountain man and his companion holding up progress." "That land should have been mine," Sarah hissed. "I kept her here for 3 years, waiting for her to turn 18 so I could convince her to sign it over. Then she had to go snooping through her father's old trunk." Morton set down his cup with precise movements. "Perhaps we should discuss how to resolve this situation. The railroad company can be quite generous to those who help clear the way for expansion." Sarah's eyes gleamed. "I'm listening." "The deed must be recorded at the county courthouse to be legally binding," Morton explained. "If something were to happen to it before then," he left the sentence hanging. "That mountain man won't be easy to handle," Sarah warned. "He's a surly one, Luca McBride. Lives alone up in the hills, keeps to himself mostly." "Every man has his weakness." Morton smiled thinly. "And now we know that girl he's protecting. Make sure our associates understand, get the deed, whatever it takes, but no permanent harm to anyone. The railroad doesn't need that kind of attention." Sarah nodded, already planning. "I know just the men for the job." Back at the cabin, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Luca moved restlessly between windows, his rifle close at hand. The day had passed tensely, with both of them watching the tree line for movement. Penelope tried to keep busy, but her hands shook as she packed supplies for their journey tomorrow. "Do you think they'll try something tonight?" "Maybe." Luca checked his rifle's action again. "But we'll be ready." As if in answer to his words, a twig snapped in the gathering darkness. Luca motioned Penelope away from the window, raising his rifle. Shadows moved between the trees, 3 men, trying to stay hidden. "Evening, McBride," a voice called out. "Just passing through. No need for guns." "You're trespassing," Luca answered firmly. "Best move on." A quiet laugh floated through the friended darkness. "Now, that ain't friendly. We only want to talk business. About that deed the lady found." Penelope's hand found Luca's arm, squeezing tight. He kept his voice steady. "Nothing to discuss. This is private property. Won't be private much longer." Another voice threatened. "Railroad's coming through whether you like it or not." Luca's finger tensed on the trigger. Last warning. Clear out now. A few tense moments passed, then the shadows retreated. But Luca didn't lower his rifle. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "We need to leave at first light. Get that deed recorded before they try something worse." Penelope nodded, her face set with determination. "I'll finish packing now. We can't let them steal Papa's legacy." Through the long night, they took turns watching. Luca cleaned his rifle and checked their supplies while Penelope carefully packed the deed and letters in oilcloth to protect them from snow. She added provisions, spare clothes, and her father's Bible, each item chosen with purpose. "The courthouse is 2 days' ride," Luca explained as they planned. "We'll need to be careful. Stay off the main trails. They'll likely try to stop us before we get there." Penelope's hand stilled on the pack she was filling. "I'm sorry to bring such trouble to your door." "Don't be." Luca's voice was gentle but firm. "This land is your birthright, and I mean to see you claim it proper." They worked quietly as the night deepened. Occasional sounds from the forest kept them alert, snapping twigs, the soft crunch of snow under boots. Their unwelcome visitors were still out there, watching. Near midnight, Penelope finished her packing and joined Luca by the window. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the snow. In that pale glow, fresh tracks were clearly visible, circling ever closer to the cabin. "They're testing us," Luca murmured, "seeing how we'll react." Penelope straightened her shoulders. "They won't find us weak." Luca glanced at her, approval warming his eyes. "No, they won't. You're stronger than they know." They shared a moment of quiet understanding. Then, Luca's expression grew serious again. "Try to rest while you can. Dawn's coming soon, and we'll need to move fast." Penelope nodded and moved to her bedroll near the fire, though she knew sleep would be elusive. The deed and letters were tucked safely in her coat, close to her heart. She wouldn't let anyone take them, not the railroad, not Sarah Blackwood, not anyone. Through the remaining hours of darkness, Luca kept his vigil. Every so often, Penelope heard him moving quietly through the cabin, checking windows, adding wood to the fire, ensuring their safety. His presence was a comfort, solid and dependable as the mountains themselves. Finally, the eastern sky began to lighten. Penelope rose quietly and began preparing a simple breakfast. They ate quickly, speaking little, both aware of what lay ahead. "Ready?" Luca asked as the first true light of dawn crept over the mountains. Penelope squared her shoulders and nodded. "Ready." They would face whatever came together, she realized. The thought gave her strength as she shouldered her pack and stepped toward the door. Outside, fresh snow was falling, beginning to cover the tracks of their nighttime visitors. Luca checked his rifle one final time before slinging it across his back. His eyes met Penelope's, filled with quiet determination. "Let's go claim your land." The morning stretched before them, full of both promise and peril. But as they prepared to step out into it, Penelope felt no fear. She had truth on her side, and more importantly, she had Luca beside her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Dawn painted the sky in delicate brushstrokes of pink and gold as Luca hitched his horses to the wagon. The fresh snow sparkled like scattered diamonds, pristine and untouched. Penelope stood in the cabin doorway, clutching their precious bundle of supplies and documents close to her chest. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp morning air. "Everything's ready," Luca called softly, adjusting the final harness strap. "We need to move before the snow gets deeper." Penelope nodded and made her way carefully to the wagon, her boots crunching in the snow. Luca helped her up onto the seat, his strong hands steady and sure. The wooden bench was cold beneath her, but Luca had thoughtfully laid down extra blankets for comfort. "Keep the rifle close," he instructed as he climbed up beside her. "And stay alert. Those men might still be watching." The horses' hooves broke through the fresh powder as they started down the mountain trail. Luca handled the reins with skilled confidence, guiding them through the most level paths. Still, the wagon jolted and swayed over the rough terrain. As the sun climbed higher, the snow began falling again, fat, lazy flakes that settled on their shoulders and made the horses snort and shake their heads. Their progress slowed to a careful crawl. "The snow's getting worse," Penelope observed, pulling her coat tighter. Luca nodded grimly. "Making our tracks easier to follow, too. But it'll slow down anyone trying to catch up just as much." They traveled in companionable silence for several hours, both scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of pursuit. The cold crept in despite their layers of clothing. By midday, Penelope's teeth were chattering. "We'll stop soon," Luca promised, noticing her discomfort. "Need to rest the horses anyway." When they found a sheltered clearing beside a frozen creek, Luca helped Penelope down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from sitting, and she stumbled slightly. His arm went around her waist to steady her, the touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she murmured, color rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. While Luca tended to the horses, Penelope gathered dry wood from beneath the snow-laden pines. Soon she had a cheerful fire crackling, its warmth a blessed relief. She pulled out their cooking supplies and began mixing cornmeal with water. "Smells good," Luca commented, settling down beside the fire. He looked tired, the strain of constant vigilance showing in the lines around his eyes. "Rest a while," Penelope urged. "I'll keep watch." He hesitated, then nodded, stretching out near the fire with his rifle close at hand. Penelope worked quietly, pouring the corn cake batter onto the hot griddle. The familiar task brought comfort, a touch of normalcy in their uncertain situation. As the cakes cooked, she found herself humming softly an old hymn her mother used to sing. Luca's eyes opened at the sound, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's pretty," he said finally. "Reminds me of Sunday mornings long ago." Penelope smiled, flipping the golden brown cakes. "I've been thinking about Sundays. If we get the deed recorded, when we build on the land, we could have a proper church gathering place." "A church?" Luca sat up, interested. "And a schoolhouse, too," she continued, growing animated. "There are so many children in the mining camps with nowhere to learn. I could teach them reading, writing, figures, give them a chance at something better." "You'd be good at that," Luca said softly. "You've got a gentle way about you." She handed him a plate of corn cakes, their fingers brushing. "What about you? What do you dream about?" Luca was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Lately, I've been thinking about family again. After Sarah died, I never thought. But maybe." He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. "Tell me," Penelope encouraged gently. "A home," he said finally. "A real home, not just a cabin to survive in. Children's laughter instead of just whined in the pines. Someone to share the quiet evenings with." Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. Penelope's heart beat faster. But before either could speak, a branch cracked in the forest. Luca was on his feet instantly, rifle ready. "Time to move," he said tersely. "We've stayed too long already." They quickly packed up their camp, leaving no trace behind. The afternoon passed in tense silence as they pushed on through deepening snow. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned with the effort. As evening approached, they made another brief stop to rest the horses. This time they didn't risk a fire, sharing cold biscuits and jerky instead. The temperature dropped sharply as darkness fell, and they had no choice but to make camp for the night. Luca chose a defensive position, a small rise backed by steep rocks. They kept the fire small, more for warmth than light. Neither slept much, taking turns watching through the long night. Dawn of the second day brought clearer skies but bitter cold. They set out early, knowing they were still at least 8 hours from town. The morning passed without incident, but Luca's tension was evident in the set of his shoulders. "We're getting close now," he said as they crossed a familiar creek. "This is where they're most likely to." The crack of a rifle cut him off. A bullet splintered the wagon seat between them. Penelope screamed as Luca yanked her down, nearly pulling her off the wagon. "Stay down," he ordered, raising his own rifle. 3 men on horseback emerged from the trees ahead, guns drawn. "That's far enough, McBride," one called out. "Just give us the deed and nobody needs to get hurt." Luca's answer was a warning shot that kicked up snow at the leader's horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. "Next one won't miss," Luca shouted. "Back off now." Instead, the men spread out, trying to flank the wagon. Another shot whistled past, too close. Penelope clutched the oilskin packet containing the deed, her heart pounding. Luca fired again, catching one man's hat and sending it flying. The would-be thieves hesitated, clearly not expecting such accurate return fire. "Last chance," Luca warned, his voice deadly calm. "Or the next one goes somewhere that matters." The conviction in his tone must have convinced them. After a tense moment, They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving only hoofprints in the snow. When they were gone, Penelope realized she was shaking. Luca pulled her close, his arm strong around her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked gruffly, concern evident in his voice. She nodded, unable to speak just yet. The reality of what they faced, what people would do for greed, had never been so clear. "They'll be back," Luca said, clicking the reins to get the horses moving again. "With more men, probably. We need to push hard now." Penelope straightened up, squaring her shoulders. Fear still trembled in her belly. But something else was there too: determination. This land was her father's legacy, her rightful inheritance. She wouldn't let anyone steal it through violence or intimidation. "Then let's push hard," she said firmly. "I'm not afraid." Luca glanced at her, pride and something warmer flickering in his eyes. "No," he agreed softly. "You're not afraid at all." They drove on through the morning, both alert for any sign of pursuit. The deed remained safe against Penelope's heart, and her resolve grew stronger with every mile. She had seen firsthand now what it meant to stand up for what was right, had witnessed Luca's quiet courage in defending her claim. The town lay ahead, and with it the courthouse where they could finally secure her rights. But more than that, she realized, lay the promise of dreams shared by firelight, of a schoolhouse filled with children's voices, of a home built on love and trust, of a future neither of them had dared imagine before finding each other. The courthouse loomed before them, its weathered brick facade a stark contrast to the pristine snow blanketing the ground. Penelope's hands trembled as she clutched the oilskin packet containing her father's deed. Luca stood close beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. Together, they climbed the worn wooden steps and pushed through the heavy double doors. The smell of dust and old paper filled the air, along with the quiet murmur of voices and scratch of pens. At the clerk's desk, Penelope carefully unwrapped the deed, smoothing its creased surface with trembling fingers. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined the document with painstaking slowness. "Everything appears to be in order," he said finally, reaching for his stamp. "Judge Harrison will need to review and validate the claim, of course, given the circumstances." His eyes flicked briefly to Penelope, then away. "When can we see the judge?" Luca asked, his deep voice carrying an edge of authority that made the clerk sit straighter. "He can hear the case next Wednesday morning." The clerk made a notation in his thick ledger. 10 o'clock sharp. All interested parties should be present. Penelope's stomach clenched. A week. 7 days to prepare herself to face not only the judge but the boarding house mistress and whoever else might contest her claim. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky. Penelope hugged herself against the cold, fighting back tears of anxiety. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, speaking in front of everyone. "They'll all be staring, judging." "Look at me," Luca said firmly, turning to face her. His weathered hands gripped her shoulders gently. "You're stronger than you know. I've seen it every day since you came to my cabin. The truth is on your side." A group of townsfolk passed by, their whispers carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Poor judge, having to look at that fat girl for hours. Probably can't even read the deed herself. Shame about McBride getting mixed up in this mess." Penelope flinched at each barbed comment, but Luca's grip on her shoulders tightened protectively. His jaw clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "Don't give them power over you," he murmured. "They're nothing but wind in empty spaces." She managed a weak smile, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "Where will we stay until the hearing?" "None. I know a place," Luca said, leading her down the street. "Good Christian folks who won't turn anyone away." The Harper family lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, its neat yard enclosed by a white picket fence. Sarah Harper, a plump woman with kind eyes, opened the door at Luca's knock. "Luca McBride," As I live and breathe, she exclaimed. We've missed you at services. Her gaze shifted to Penelope, warming with genuine welcome. And who's this? Penelope Harding, Luca introduced. She needs a safe place to stay until next week's hearing, I was hoping. Say no more, Sarah interrupted, opening the door wider. Any friend of Luca's is family here. Come in, come in. You both look half frozen. The house's interior radiated warmth and comfort. Delicious smells wafted from the kitchen, and children's laughter echoed from upstairs. John Harper, Sarah's husband, greeted them with equal enthusiasm, pulling up extra chairs to the hearth. Over steaming cups of coffee, Luca explained their situation. The Harpers listened with growing concern, their faces darkening at the tale of corruption and greed. Of course you'll stay, John said firmly when Luca finished. Both of you. We have plenty of room, and you'll be safer here than at the hotel. That evening, the family gathered for their nightly devotions. Penelope sat among them, wrapped in the comfort of their acceptance. Sarah's clear voice led them in familiar hymns, the children's sweet voices joining in. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The music filled the room, seeping into Penelope's worried heart like balm. She closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. When she opened them, she noticed Luca watching the family with an expression of mingled longing and pain. Later, as Sarah showed them to their rooms, Penelope overheard Luca speaking quietly with John in the study. I haven't set foot in church since Sarah died, Luca admitted. Couldn't face him, but lately. The Lord's timing is perfect, John replied gently. Perhaps he sent Penelope to help heal that wound. In her borrowed room, Penelope knelt beside the bed, her hands clasped tightly. Lord, she whispered, I'm so afraid, but I know you're with me. Please give me the courage to speak your truth, and please help Luca find his way back to you. Each morning, Penelope practiced speaking aloud, reciting the facts of her case while Sarah listened encouragingly. The children often gathered around, their innocent acceptance helping ease her self-consciousness. You have such a nice voice, Miss Penelope, little Mary Harper said one afternoon, soft like Mama's quilts. These moments of kindness helped balance the cruel whispers that followed her through town. The boarding house mistress had spread vicious rumors, painting Penelope as a thief and worse. But within the Harper home, she found refuge. Luca spent his days gathering witnesses who could verify Penelope's identity and her father's ownership of the land. Each evening, he returned with news of his progress, though the strain of dealing with townspeople showed in the tight lines around his eyes. On Sunday morning, Sarah gently suggested they all attend services together. Penelope agreed immediately, but Luca hesitated. I don't know if I'm ready, he said gruffly. Then just come and sit, Sarah replied. The Lord meets us where we are. To Penelope's surprise, Luca nodded slowly. At the small church, they sat together in the Harper's pew. During the opening hymn, she felt Luca's shoulders tremble slightly. Reaching over, she squeezed his hand. He gripped back tightly, and they remained connected throughout the service. That night, unable to sleep, Penelope found Luca sitting alone on the back porch. The moon cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Thank you, she said softly, settling beside him. For coming to church today. I know it wasn't easy. Hadn't realized how much I missed it, he admitted. The singing especially. Sarah, my Sarah. She loved to sing hymns while she worked. Tell me about her? Penelope asked gently. Luca was quiet for a long moment. She was like sunshine, he said finally. Always smiling, always seeing the good in everything. When the fever took her, and our unborn child, I couldn't understand why God would allow it. Turned my back on everything. But you didn't stop believing, Penelope observed. Not really. You just stopped trusting. He looked at her then, something soft and wondering in his gaze. How do you see so clear into people's hearts? Maybe because I know what it's like to feel lost, she replied. But God never loses us. He just waits for us to find our way back. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon's slow journey across the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. 3 days before the hearing, Penelope stood in the Harpers' parlor, practicing her testimony one final time. Her voice, once shaky and uncertain, had grown stronger with each repetition. "I am Penelope Harding, daughter of Thomas Harding," she declared clearly. "This land was my father's legacy to me, his only child. I have the deed, signed and witnessed, proving my rightful claim." "Well done," Sarah praised, wiping proud tears from her eyes. "You're ready, dear heart. The truth shines in every word." Luca, standing in the doorway, nodded in agreement. "No judge could doubt your sincerity," he said softly, "or your right to what's yours." That evening, as the family gathered for prayers, Penelope noticed Luca's lips moving silently along with the words. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, and she saw in his face the first real stirrings of renewed faith. The night before the hearing, none of them could sleep. Sarah brewed chamomile tea, and they all sat around the kitchen table, talking quietly. The children, sensing the gravity of tomorrow's events, pressed close to Penelope. "Will you still visit us after you win?" 8-year-old Thomas Harper asked anxiously. "Of course I will," Penelope assured him, her heart warming at their obvious affection. "You're like family now." "You are family," Sarah corrected firmly. "Both of you." She included Luca in her gentle smile. Later, in her room, Penelope heard soft footsteps in the hall. A note slipped under her door, a Bible verse in Luca's rough handwriting. "Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." She pressed the paper to her heart, tears of gratitude sliding down her cheeks. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she wasn't alone. She had found not just allies but true family. People who saw past her size to her heart, who valued her for herself. Kneeling by her bed one final time, Penelope prayed not just for courage but for wisdom, not just for victory but for justice, and most of all, she prayed for the man whose quiet strength had helped her find her own, that his wounded heart might finally heal in the warmth of renewed faith and love. The Harper household bustled with activity in the days leading up to the hearing. Sarah Harper maintained her usual routines despite their guests, insisting that work and purpose helped ease worried minds. Penelope eagerly offered to help, grateful for the chance to be useful. Early one morning, she sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, sorting through a basket of mending. Her fingers worked swiftly, needle flashing in the lamplight as she repaired a torn shirt sleeve. "My word, those are the tiniest stitches I've ever seen," Sarah marveled, examining Penelope's work. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" Penelope blushed at the praise. "My mother taught me before she passed. She always said careful stitches show you care about the person you're sewing for." "Well then, my Thomas will feel mighty cared for in this shirt," Sarah smiled. "Would you consider helping me with some of the church mending? There's always more than I can manage alone." "I'd love to," Penelope replied, her face brightening. "It would be nice to do something worthwhile while we wait." Outside, the rhythmic thunk of an axe marked where Luca worked alongside John Harper, building up the church's woodpile for winter. The morning air rang with the sound of splitting logs and good-natured conversation between the two men. Inside, 10-year-old Mary Harper peered shyly around the kitchen door. "Mama, could Miss Penelope help me with my letters? I'm stuck on this passage." Sarah glanced at Penelope, who nodded eagerly. "Of course, dear. Bring your book to the table." Soon, Mary sat beside Penelope, carefully sounding out words from her reader. Penelope's gentle encouragement and patience drew the other Harper children, and before long she had an impromptu reading circle gathered around her. "You have such a nice way with them," Sarah observed later, as the children scattered to their chores. Have you ever thought of teaching? I've dreamed of it, Penelope admitted. But who would hire someone like me? Someone who values knowledge and kindness over appearances. Sarah replied firmly. Don't sell yourself short, dear. Throughout the week, word spread through town about the quiet industry at the Harper home. Ladies from the church stopped by, ostensibly to drop off mending, but really to meet the mysterious young woman staying there. They found not the scheming troublemaker they'd expected, but a gentle soul whose skilled needlework and way with children impressed them deeply. Even some of the men who had jeered at her that first day began to look thoughtful when they passed the Harper place and saw her teaching the children or hanging laundry. Her quiet dignity and willing hands spoke louder than any rumors. Luca watched these changes with satisfaction, though he said little. His own days were filled with honest work, chopping wood, mending fences, and helping John with church repairs. The physical labor helped ease his restlessness, and he found unexpected peace in the rhythm of simple tasks. One afternoon, as Penelope hung sheets on the line, she heard Sarah greeting visitors. The widow Jensen and her daughter had brought more mending, along with fresh-baked bread. We've heard how good you are with a needle, the widow said warmly to Penelope. Would you consider helping with my Jenny's wedding dress? My eyes aren't what they used to be for fine work. Penelope's heart swelled at this simple acceptance. I'd be honored, she replied, blinking back tears. But not everyone's attitudes had softened. 5 days before the hearing, Penelope walked to the general store with Sarah to purchase thread. As they approached the store's porch, a familiar voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Well, if it isn't the thieving girl herself, the boarding house mistress called out loudly. Mrs. Trent stood with several of her regular boarders, her face twisted in a sneer, putting on quite a show of respectability. Aren't you? Penelope froze, her hand tightening on Sarah's arm. The street wasn't crowded, but several people stopped to watch. Come along, dear, Sarah murmured, trying to guide Penelope past the group. But Mrs. Trent stepped directly into their path. You really think anyone's fooled? A fat girl with nothing to her name, trying to steal what rightfully belongs to others? She laughed harshly. No judge will believe your lies. Penelope felt the familiar shame rising, threatening to choke her. Her cheeks burned as she heard snickers from Mrs. Trent's companions. For a moment, she was back on that snowy street, exposed and humiliated. Then she felt a strong hand on her shoulder. Luca had appeared beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His quiet support straightened Penelope's spine. Taking a deep breath, she looked directly at Mrs. Trent. The truth will speak for itself, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the sudden hush. I have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. Mrs. Trent's face darkened with rage. You dare. Yes, I dare, Penelope interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I dare to stand up for what's right. I dare to trust that justice will prevail. And I dare to hold my head high, knowing that my worth isn't measured by cruel words or false judgments. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Several people nodded approvingly. Mrs. Trent glanced around, sensing the shift in mood. Her sneer faltered. Come on, she muttered to her companions. No point wasting time on her kind. They swept past, but their exit felt more like a retreat. Penelope's legs trembled, but she remained standing tall. Luca's hand squeezed her shoulder gently before dropping away. Well done, Sarah whispered, her eyes bright with pride. Inside the store, the proprietor's wife served them herself, adding an extra spool of thread to their purchase on the house. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through town, but this time the whispers held notes of admiration for the quiet dignity with which Penelope had faced down her tormentor. That evening, as the Harper family gathered for supper, little Mary presented Penelope with a carefully printed note. You are the bravest person I know. Not brave, Penelope corrected gently, hugging the child. Just learning to trust in truth and goodness. After the meal, Luca found her on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "You did good today," he said, simply, settling beside her on the steps. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But when I felt your hand on my shoulder, I remembered I wasn't alone anymore." "You're not," he agreed, "and you never will be again." They sat in comfortable silence as evening deepened around them. From inside came the sound of Sarah playing hymns on the parlor piano, the children's voices joining in sweet harmony. The music wrapped around them like a warm blanket, a reminder of the family they had found in this place. "Penelope," Luca said quietly, "whatever happens at the hearing, I want you to know." "Supper's ready," John called from inside, interrupting whatever Luca had been about to say. They rose together, sharing a smile before heading inside to join the others. The warmth and light spilling from the kitchen windows seemed to push back the gathering darkness, a beacon of hope in the uncertain days ahead. The next morning, Penelope resumed her usual tasks with renewed determination. She helped Sarah with breakfast, taught the children their lessons, and worked on the widow Jensen's daughter's wedding dress. Each small act of service felt like a declaration. Down, Mog. She belonged here, among these good people who had taken her in. When another group of ladies from church brought by more mending, she welcomed them with genuine warmth. Their chatter and laughter filled the Harpers' sitting room as they worked together, sharing stories and encouragement. "You know," one elderly woman said thoughtfully, "I reckon we were too quick to judge based on idle gossip. The Lord looks on the heart, not the outer appearance." "And some hearts shine brighter than others," Sarah added, smiling at Penelope. Outside, Luca and John continued their work on the church repairs, the steady rhythm of their hammers a counterpoint to the women's conversation. Several men from the congregation had joined them, drawn by John's tales of Luca's skill with tools and quiet strength of character. As evening approached, Penelope stood in the yard hanging the last of the washing. The setting sun caught the white sheets, making them glow like angel wings in the golden light. She thought about how far she had come from that terrified girl in the snow, and smiled. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Luca stood there, his expression soft in the fading light. "Need any help?" he asked. "I'm nearly finished," she replied, "but thank you for offering." He nodded, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. But before he could speak, Sarah called them in to supper, and the moment passed like a cloud across the Sunday. Inside, the Harper home glowed with lamplight and fellowship, a haven of peace in a world that sometimes seemed too harsh. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Penelope knew she had found something precious here, not just shelter, but belonging. The evening had settled into peaceful quiet at the Harper house. Penelope sat in the parlor, working by lamplight on Jenny Jensen's wedding dress. Her fingers moved steadily through the delicate lace as she listened to the muffled sounds of John and Sarah putting their children to bed upstairs. A sharp crack split the night. Shouts erupted from the direction of the boarding house where Luca was staying. "Fire! Fire at Miller's boarding house!" Penelope's heart stopped. She rushed to the window, the wedding dress falling forgotten from her lap. Orange flames licked up the side of the building, spreading with terrifying speed. Dark figures scattered in the street as more shouts rang out. "Luca," she whispered, then louder. "Luca." She ran for the door, not even stopping for a shawl. Sarah called after her, but Penelope was already racing down the street, her skirts gathered in her hands. The heat hit her face as she neared the boarding house. A crowd had gathered, passing buckets of water in a line from the town pump. "Second floor," someone yelled. "There's still people up there." Smoke poured from the windows of Luca's floor. Penelope pushed through the crowd, searching desperately for his familiar form. The flames roared louder, drowning out individual voices in their hungry crackle. Then she saw him, stumbling out the front door, helping another boarder. His shirt sleeves were charred, angry red burns visible on his forearms, but he turned right back toward the entrance. Luca, no, Penelope cried out. He paused just long enough to lock eyes with her. Others still inside, he said hoarsely, and disappeared back into the smoke. Penelope pressed her hands to her mouth, praying harder than she ever had before. Minutes stretched like hours until finally, Luca emerged again, half carrying elderly Mrs. Miller. They collapsed onto the street as the bucket brigade continued their fight against the flames. Penelope ran to them. Mrs. Miller was coughing but conscious. Luca's face was streaked with soot, his breathing labored. The burns on his arms looked terrible in the firelight. Everyone's out. He managed between coughs. Checked. Every room. You need a doctor, Penelope said, trying to help him stand. He swayed on his feet. The clinic's closed for the night. Someone in the crowd called out. Doc Wilson's out at the Peterson farm. Bring him to the church, came a strong voice. Reverend Thomas pushed through the gathering. I have supplies there, and plenty of experience with burns from my army days. John Harper appeared at Luca's other side, helping support him. Together they made their way to the church, leaving the bucket brigade to their work. Penelope's heart ached at each pained breath Luca took. The church basement was cool and dark until Reverend Thomas lit several lamps. They helped Luca onto a cot while the preacher gathered his medical supplies. I need to cut away these sleeves, he said gently. The fabric stuck to some of the burns. Luca nodded, jaw clenched. Penelope held his hand as Reverend Thomas carefully cut and peeled away the burned, ruined shirt. The burns weren't as deep as they'd first appeared, but they covered most of both forearms. This will hurt, the preacher warned, beginning to clean the wounds. Luca's hand tightened on Penelope's, but he made no sound. I'll fetch some blankets, John said quietly, heading upstairs. Penelope watched helplessly as Reverend Thomas worked, applying salve and wrapping clean bandages around Luca's arms. Tears slipped down her cheeks. This is my fault, she whispered. They did this because of me, because you're helping me. No. Luca's voice was rough, but firm. The fault lies with them, not you. But if I hadn't, worth protecting, Penelope. His eyes held hers steadily. Always. Fresh tears spilled over. She dropped her head, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Luca freed his hand from hers only to brush her tears away with his thumb. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours, he said softly. John returned with blankets and a pitcher of water. Sarah arrived soon after, bringing bread and cold meat from their kitchen. You'll stay here tonight, Reverend Thomas said. Both of you. The basement stays cool and dry, good for burns, and it's safer than anywhere else in town right now. Thank you, Penelope said fervently. We have no way to repay such kindness. The Lord's house is open to all who need shelter, the preacher replied simply. Try to rest now. I'll check the burns again in the morning. After the others had gone, Penelope settled onto a second cot near Luca's. The lamplight cast soft shadows on the stone walls. Neither of them slept for a long while. I was so afraid, Penelope finally whispered into the quiet. When I saw the flames. I heard them, Luca said. Before the fire. Men's voices outside my window. Knew something was wrong. Was already heading out when they threw the torches. Penelope's hands clenched in her skirts. They meant to kill you. Meant to scare us, he corrected. Make us run before the hearing. It won't work, she said fiercely. I won't let them win through violence and threats. A small smile touched Luca's lips. There's that courage again. I'm not brave. Just tired of being afraid. That's what real courage is, he said quietly. Silence fell between them again, but it was comfortable now, wrapped in shared understanding. Penelope watched the steady rise and fall of Luca's chest until her own breathing slowed to match it. I never thanked you, she murmured, sleep starting to blur her thoughts. That first day in the snow. You could have ridden past like everyone else. Couldn't, he replied simply. Saw you there and couldn't. Something in his voice made her heart flutter. She wanted to ask what he meant, but exhaustion was pulling her under. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Luca's face turned toward her in the dim light, his expression soft with an emotion she didn't dare name. Morning came with pale light filtering through the high basement windows. Reverend Thomas arrived early to check Luca's burns. The angry red had faded somewhat, though the skin was still tender and blistered in places. Keep them clean and wrapped, the preacher instructed. Try not to use your arms more than necessary for a few days. The hearing's in 3 days, Luca reminded him. I need to be able to. You need to heal, Penelope interrupted firmly. I won't have you making these worse on my account. Their eyes met in a silent battle of wills until Luca finally nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said, with just a hint of a smile. Sarah brought them breakfast, hot coffee, eggs, and more fresh bread. As they ate, Reverend Thomas shared what he'd learned about the fire. The marshal's investigating, but, he shook his head, no witnesses willing to speak up. Everyone knows it wasn't an accident, but proving it. Doesn't matter, Luca said. Truth's what counts now. 3 days till the hearing. We focus on that. Penelope watched him struggling to hold his coffee cup with bandaged hands, and her heart squeezed painfully. This brave, gentle man had suffered protecting her, yet instead of blame, his eyes held only warmth when they met hers. Love, she realized suddenly. That's what she saw in his gaze, what she felt blooming in her own heart. Not just gratitude or friendship, but something deeper, stronger, something neither of them had dared speak aloud. She reached over and steadied his cup, her fingers brushing his. Here, she said softly. Let me help. His smile told her he understood what she wasn't saying. They would face whatever came next together, drawing strength from this precious thing growing between them. They spent that day in the cool quiet of the church basement, accepting visits from concerned townspeople. Jenny Jensen brought soup. The widow Thompson arrived with clean shirts for Luca. Even the general store owner's wife stopped by with fresh bandages and more salve. Not everyone supports what happened, Reverend Thomas told them. Good people know right from wrong. Penelope nodded, touched by these small kindnesses. Perhaps she and Luca weren't as alone as their enemies wanted them to feel. That evening, as sunset painted the basement windows gold, Luca watched Penelope arranging their simple supper on a small table. Thank you, he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. For what? For giving me something to believe in again, something worth fighting for. Penelope's hands stilled on the plates. I should be thanking you. You've risked everything to help me. Worth it, he said simply. The love in his voice wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She met his eyes, no longer afraid of what she saw there. Whatever the hearing might bring, they had found something precious in each other, something that couldn't be burned away or stolen, something worth protecting, always. Penelope smoothed the borrowed dress with trembling hands. Martha Thompson had insisted she wear the navy blue wool, 2P4. It brings out your eyes, dear. The fabric was finer than anything Penelope had worn since leaving home. Her father's Bible lay heavy in her hands, its leather worn soft from years of faithful reading. Inside, tucked carefully between the pages of Psalms, rested the deed that could change everything. You sure you don't want me there? Luca asked from his chair by the church basement window. His burns were healing, but walking even short distances left him pale with pain. The courthouse is 6 blocks away, Penelope said gently. You need to rest those arms. I can do this. He caught her hand as she passed, squeezing it once. You're stronger than you know. The morning air was crisp as Penelope made her way down the street. Townsfolk stopped to stare, their whispers following her like shadows. She clutched the Bible closer, drawing strength from its familiar weight. Inside the courthouse, the wooden benches creaked with spectators. The boarding house mistress sat near the front, her face pinched with false concern. Deputy Marshal Callahan nodded slightly as Penelope passed. When Judge Harrison called her forward, Penelope's legs shook, but as she laid the deed before him, her voice came out clear and steady. "My father left this land to me," she said, meeting his eyes. The deed was hidden in his trunk of personal effects. Mrs. Whitmore had no right to claim otherwise. The boarding house mistress's testimony followed, full of dramatic sighs and accusations, but under the judge's careful questions, her story began to unravel. She couldn't explain how she'd obtained guardianship papers without Penelope's knowledge. Her claims about managing the inheritance fell apart when pressed for details. Through it all, Penelope stood straight, her faith holding her steady as truth came to light. Mrs. Whitmore's face grew pale as the judge pressed her for details. Her fingers twisted her handkerchief as she stammered through another contradiction. "Your Honor," the court clerk interrupted, stepping forward with a bundle of papers. "I have here the original correspondence between Miss Harding and her father, dated just 6 months ago." He laid out several letters beside the deed. The signatures matched perfectly. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The clerk pointed to the flowing script. "See here, and here." The same hand wrote both. Mrs. Whitmore half rose from her seat. "But I told you." "Silence," Judge Harrison commanded. The heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Luca McBride appeared in the doorway, leaning on rough-hewn crutches. His arms were wrapped in clean bandages, but his eyes were clear and determined as he made his way slowly down the aisle. Each step seemed to cost him, but he didn't falter until he reached Penelope's side. The judge studied the documents one final time, then raised his gavel. "This court finds in favor of Miss Penelope Harding. The deed and all associated rights are hereby restored to her possession. Mrs. Whitmore's claims are dismissed." The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks as the truth of her victory washed over her. Around the courtroom, townsfolk who had mocked her size and worth now bowed their heads, shame clear on their faces. Mrs. Whitmore fled the courthouse, but Penelope barely noticed. She could only feel Luca's strong presence beside her, supporting her as she had supported him, while justice and vindication wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Spring sunlight danced on the river as Luca and Penelope pitched their tent beneath towering pines. The sound of rushing water filled their ears, a constant melody of hope. Their new beginning stretched before them like the endless Colorado sky. "Just listen to that water," Penelope said, spreading a checkered cloth for their meal. "Father always said this land had music in it." Within days, wagons arrived from town, the Harper family leading others from the church. Men raised axes while women laid out food on rough tables. Log by log, their cabin took shape. Luca worked steadily despite his healing arm, directing the work with quiet authority. Neighbors they'd never met brought housewarming gifts, quilts, preserves, even a mother cat with kittens. Under the shade of an old oak tree, Penelope gathered children on a worn blanket, teaching them their letters. Their small voices carried on the breeze as they sounded out words from her primer. Each evening, lamplight glowed through their new windows. Over simple suppers, Luca and Penelope shared soft laughter that chased away memories of darker days. Their prayers of gratitude rose with the hearth smoke. UConn 19. Thanksgiving for mercy, for second chances, for love that grew from ashes into something beautiful and true. Spring painted the riverside with wildflowers as warmth returned to the mountains. Inside their finished cabin, golden lamplight spilled across pine floors worn smooth by boots and bare feet. The aroma of fresh-baked bread filled every corner while wood shavings curled beneath Luca's careful knife. He shaped a small cross from cedar, his hands steady with purpose. Friends from town gathered in the snug room, the Harpers, church families, even some who had once turned away but now came bearing gifts and seeking forgiveness. Children perched on benches, watching wide-eyed as the preacher opened his Bible. Penelope wore a simple blue dress, her cheeks flushed with joy. Luca stood tall beside her, his scars a badge of devotion. When he slipped the plain gold band onto her finger, his voice was rough with emotion. "God didn't just give me a horse to ride home with you," he whispered. "He gave me a family." Tears gleamed in Penelope's eyes as she squeezed his hand. The room filled with gentle applause and familiar hymns, voices rising together in celebration of love restored. As evening settled over the land, the newlyweds stepped out onto their porch. The river whispered, below, its waters catching the last light. Penelope leaned against Luca's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist. Together they gazed over their land, the garden plots marked out for spring planting, the smoke rising peaceful from their chimney, the promise of all their tomorrows stretching before them like the endless Colorado sky. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.